Guns, Guns, Gears and Guns with Gary Gunderson. I am Boba Fett. Today we are taking a look at a rifle build inspired by me.
Alright, what I have here is a KE Arms KP-15 lower I purchased. It's a complete lower that had a parts kit already installed, but I made further changes, adding an ambi safety and bolt release. The upper is a Palmetto State Armory 16-inch mid-length pencil barrel nitride 15-inch M-lock upper. I changed out the charging handle with an ambidextrous one and changed out the A2 flash hider with a Midwest Industries blast can because I liked the look for a Star Wars rifle. The scope is a Bushnell 1-6x24 AR sight with a throw lever to zoom in. It's mounted in a primary arms 30mm mount. I thought about just doing a red dot here, but I think the longer scope is more reminiscent of Boba Fett's Blast Tech EE3 rifle, which is based on a World War I era Webley and Scott flare pistol. Plus, I think the throw lever to zoom in is a cool extra control that I think works well for a build considering the gauntlets with all the various weapons and buttons on his armor. Onto the actual painting. The number one piece of advice, and one I failed to adhere to, which caused me problems during this project, was to be patient and not rush it. Keep it about a foot away when spraying. Always move the can while you're spraying so you don't put it on too thick in any one area, and give enough time for areas to dry between coats or trying to tape up areas for detail work. If you do it too soon, you'll bring up the paint you already put down, which just causes more problems. I looked a lot of Boba Fett builds online to see what others had done and to get some ideas to bring together, and I think I wound up with a pretty unique one with some features I haven't seen on anyone else's. Before doing anything, I talked to others and looked up some advice online, but I discovered some more things on my own. One thing that became immensely helpful was some packing material that I used to cover up most of the rifle for painting specific areas. I tried a plastic trash bag at one point, and that ended poorly, with me not being able to extract it cleanly after painting. Paper trash bags or butcher paper or something similar would work as well. It was handy because you only had to tape a smaller area to save time and potentially messing up paint that was already put down, and then you fold and tape the paper to the existing tape, which could be pulled apart and folded away to keep the wet paint away from unwanted areas. The first step of the painting process is to disassemble the rifle and clean it. Tape over all the holes that lead into the interior of the rifle. Do this carefully and thoroughly. I used a pick and punches to help press the tape into the holes firmly to keep the paint from leaking in. I used frog tape specifically for my painter's tape, as it's advertised as being more adhesive, and I've had regular cheap blue painter's tape leak on me before. I ended up using almost the entire roll for the project. There's not much left. I started out with a base coat of Hunt Club Green. I thought it matched the colors best from the Mandalorian Season 2. I was really going for the look from the repaint for this rifle rather than the really weathered look from the original trilogy. Obviously, there's already additional damage at the start of Book of Boba Fett, but I liked the clean look and thought it would be a bit different from other builds. Plus, it meant I didn't have to bother with all the weathering. Color-wise, overall, I did my best with spray paints available. There's loads of documentation and exact pigments for the armor colors down to the exact location where there's damage from the original trilogy appearances, but that's kind of lacking for the recent Disney Plus series. But I did my best, spending a lot of time checking photos from Mandalorian with photos of colors to find the best ones for this job. When I put on the base coat, I suspended the rifle between two ladders with some wire that I used to hang targets up. That way I could get more coverage all at once and kind of coat it evenly. You do have to be careful when you're getting it out of the wire. I put it through the sling slot on the rear of the KP-15 lower. Be careful so you don't scratch the paint. Starting at the back, the Mythosaur skull. It turned out, I think, the best of my detail painting I did for this project. I taped the outline for the yellow first based on a stencil that I bought from eBay of the skull. I just used that as an outline and extended it with some straight lines, so I thought it looked pretty good that way. For the yellow, I used Rust-Oleum Tuscan Sun. It works pretty well. It could be a little more orange, but this is what they had, and I thought it worked best from what was available. On some of the spray painting I did, especially some of the early ones, I had some overspray. So don't underestimate how far the paint will travel when you're trying to get some coverage. Protect the entire rifle pretty much every time if you can. So after I got the yellow base down and waited about a week for it to dry and harden, I taped it over completely, and then I taped the stencil to the rifle. I used an X-Acto knife and then carefully cut out the pattern of the skull, and then carefully lifted up the cutout portions to get a good stencil down. I usually use the X-Acto knife to try to pry up the tape from the interior painting areas, but do it very carefully. As it's obviously sharp and thin enough to get under the tape, that also means it's sharp enough to easily scratch and bring up the paint that you've already put down. And it may not be a big deal in most areas where you're about to paint over it again, but sometimes you can tell that you did that and it's uneven underneath, or there's some sort of color bleed through that you can tell happened. I just didn't try taping the stencil onto it and painting it, since the lower obviously isn't flat and it has texture, so I was worried about bleeding under. There was some advice I received for using stencils, and that was that when you are done painting, if you want clean lines like I did, your best bet is carefully pulling up all the tape you put down so it doesn't dry to the tape and mess up the edges when you pull it up. This can be somewhat difficult, and you have to do it slowly so you don't flick paint about or touch some painted tape somewhere else that you didn't mean to when you're pulling everything up. Now, I followed this advice some of the time, but on other areas I did not. On the really complicated patterns like the skull or the crest, which you'll get a close-up on in a bit, I didn't get good coverage with a single spray, so I decided to let it dry and layer it on with a few coats instead. And I just risked it. I did this because I figured that even though the tape is somewhat see-through and I can cut based on that or use the stencil again, I doubt I would be able to match the pattern with my cuts exactly, and it would end up looking off anyways. It mostly worked out doing it this way, so I don't really have any regrets there, so I wanted to mention it both ways. Some further advice when taping: I layered up the tape and pressed it down firmly, both when layering along the edges and after I cut and removed the tape from the painting area. I pressed it down firmly multiple times because some of the bits of tape are very thin and would be easy to lose adhesion and mess up the pattern. Press firmly and you should be able to see if anything is sticking up. In some areas I did add extra bits of tape along the edge to help hold it in place if I thought the tape maybe was weakened by cutting or looked like it might start to come up. When you're putting down the first pieces of tape, also make them longer than necessary and fold the ends so you have something to grab onto without trying to pry up the edges of the tape with your fingernail or the X-Acto knife when you're done. It will help protect the paint already there, but an X-Acto knife can work if you're careful. I just found it's easier to give yourself something to grab onto ahead of time. Some final advice on tape, which I'm kind of embarrassed I didn't figure out earlier. If you are needing to paint around something already complete, especially something elaborate for some reason you're right up to it, I put some tape down sticky side up and then put tape down regularly on top of that, so nothing sticky was touching the painted portions I wanted to protect in particular, or at the very least, it was the smallest area possible. I had the biggest problem with this on the scope where every time I put down tape, it would pull up paint. So I was going back and forth. And since it's, basically a circle, I was able to do this there without having anything sticky actually touching the scope, which helped me finish it in time. One criticism I have of myself here: the yellow could be a little more orange. I used Tuscan Sun for all of the yellow on this rifle, and for the red of the skull and other red, I used claret wine or claret wine, I don't know, Rust-Oleum, which I think turned out pretty well and was fairly close to the gauntlet colors. As for how I decided to put the skull on itself, I decided to have the teeth of the skull facing forward for two reasons. One, the stencil was too big to be placed vertically anywhere where I thought would look nice. And second, with the location on his upper arm, if he is pointing his blaster at someone, the bottom of the skull would be facing forward like this, kind of like the American flag patch where the stars can look like it's in reverse because you're supposed to be running forward with the flag. Just think of Boba Fett aiming his blaster at you, and that's why the teeth are facing forward. I used blue on the charging handle because there's a lot of blue on Boba Fett's jetpack, and I've never seen any blue on any Boba Fett builds. So I thought it would be a nice touch, and in a sense, it makes the rifle go, and kind of like a jetpack can make you kind of go, so I just thought it was fitting. For the blue, I just did Rust-Oleum navy blue. I used red for the controls on the PDQ ambi bolt release, magazine release, and safety. All of those were painted while removed from the rifle. I liked using it for the controls just because it was the same color as the gauntlets, which he obviously uses to control his weaponry. The orange hash marks are for the stripes on his helmet, and here's where I had the most issues and kind of lost patience. The paint was not getting good coverage at first when I was using it, and then I just blasted it at a closer range than I should have. It ended up leaking under the edges of the tape pretty badly, and even now you can see it's not perfect. Not only did it leak under the tape right in that area, it actually leaked in between the upper and lower a little bit, traveling around, which I had to clean up later. This, of course, led me to tape over the orange I had put down to get some green back in place where it had bled through. And then I did it back and forth a few times to try to get the orange a little bit better still, because even after blasting it, I didn't really like the look of it. To get the sizes for this area, I just kind of chose a measurement that looked right based on some measurements online and by a helmet I have, and cut pieces of tape accordingly. I chose to focus mostly on the curved portion of the upper since it's on the curve of the helmet, and extended it some at the end because I thought it looked aesthetically correct. I also know that some of the characters vary on these stripes, with the trilogy appearances looking like they were one unison color and faded around the helmet, and some of the colors looking more red than orange. But I wanted to go with orange here. You could probably just do red if you wanted to save a little bit of money and take out one additional color on here. I did yellow for the magazine well because the shape stood out so much from the rest of the lower that I thought would look good with a different solid color. Once again, it's the Tuscan Sun yellow. For the orange, I used Rust-Oleum Rustic Orange. I think it was pretty accurate. Like I said, the colors are kind of vary greatly. The red triangles are obviously like the front part of his helmet. To get this, I put just one piece of tape across, then drew a triangle and pen, cut it out, taped on the other side, and cut it out over that using that as its own stencil to make sure that they were the same size and shape. I think it's fine. It was kind of one of the last quick additions I did, but I think it has a good look and kind of breaks up the shape a little bit. For the scope mount, I just painted it red and the throw lever red for the controls. I did yellows on the edges just to make it kind of aesthetically pleasing. When I was painting the scope, I was very paranoid about getting any paint on the actual glass. So I cut out a piece of paper matching the size of the lens at each side and just kind of shoved it down in the tube close to the lens. Then I also got a cotton ball and shoved that in there as well. And then I taped along the very outer edge. So if you're looking directly behind the scope, that ring, or directly in front, the ring will be black and there's no paint on it because I did not want to risk getting paint in there and trying to clean that out or fix that. So I pressed very firmly on the tape around that ring. And I made sure I try to get that taped up and secured as much as possible. And it worked out, so it was worth being extra careful there. I had a lot of problems with the scope and pulling up paint, so I actually did kind of repainting two parts at once, the red and the yellow. And I did the yellow first, and then I tried to protect it, so I ended up having the tape extend past the rear viewing piece and made this weird chef's hat looking thing, but it worked and protected the yellow I just put down from the additional red I was putting on the throw lever area. Looks odd, but it worked. I thought the scope looks pretty good in these colors and this configuration, and kind of breaks up the profile so it's not all green or all yellow, and there's a little bit of variety in there. Initially, I was a little reluctant to do the red up front because it's something that everyone else kind of does, and I don't really see the point necessarily. But when I was finishing, I had everything at the rear and middle of the rifle, and the front just looked kind of plain and boring. At first, I did just try the very front of the blast can, and you can still pretty much tell where I did solid color at first. And then I decided to just go ahead and do the light spray, kind of like others have done. I actually think it did turn out pretty well. Since I didn't give it too heavy of a coat there, I think it looks pretty good. And if anything, maybe I would go back and do a little bit more of it if I was going to, or maybe add some other little bits of yellow or orange there. There's not much room to really add anything, so you're really kind of limited on what you can do that's kind of interesting instead of just trying to break up the color and make it look less plain. And going back from the front, which is just the regular red spray again on this side as well, we get to the words Boba Fett as the chain code for the rifle. I thought this would be a fun little addition given the chain code appearance in Mandalorian, indicating that it was indeed Boba Fett's armor. I figured why not have chain code for the rifle? I used the same orange color as the stripes since it appeared as an orangish hologram in the show. The script is Aurebesh, the primary language in Star Wars. But if you're doing this, be sure to double check your sources. At least one online translator for Aurebesh had the F backwards. I just decided to double check it to be safe, and then I verified on several others that yes, the first one I looked at was wrong. For the actual lettering here, I didn't have a stencil, and really I probably should have just printed it out in bold online, cut it out, and make my own stencil that way. But I just drew it by hand on the tape itself, and then cut that out with the X-Acto knife. And you can definitely tell that it's not completely symmetrical and not all the same size, but I think it still turned out okay. This was one of the last additions I made to the rifle, and you can see I didn't quite get some excess cleaned up. I think that got on there when I was pulling up the tape. It was worse though, but I fixed most of it. And since it was rather last minute, I did something I would not recommend, but it could be done in a pinch if you were careful. I made a loop of tape, then added a loop on top of that to get a little more height. Then I put the nozzle of the spray paint up to the loop and the bottom of the loop right up to the rifle, and did just a quick little spray, which covered up the mistake, and it didn't get anywhere else, and it wasn't too heavy coverage that's noticeable. It was really probably a dumb idea, but it did work. I can't really recommend it too much though, because if you mess up or if it gets sprayed out elsewhere, you could ruin any previous work you've done. But just some food for thought. I did red on this raised portion of the lower around the other controls just because I thought it would look similar since they're all kind of touching and around each other. And finally, we get to the crest that is on his chest plate. This took a while, and if I had more time, I may have tried to get it a little bit better or redo it. It's not up to par with the skull on the other side. And for this, I did cut my own stencils. I printed out a detailed photo of the crest and then cut out the different pieces. Then I traced those onto a thicker piece of paper and cut those out. I used the stencils in the same way as the skull, taping underneath the stencil, scoring the tape with the X-Acto knife, then prying up the tape carefully and painting. First, the blue for the base circle, the same navy blue I used before. This part of the crest is sometimes green, but the repaint in Mandalorian looks to be blue, so I did that version here. For the next layer, I used white apparently Blossom White spray paint. I actually had this one on hand already. It's the only spray paint color that I did not have to buy for this project. So that's obviously for the halves and the middle plant-like symbol. The middle plant-like symbol it's a little off. It should be a little thinner at times, especially near the top. But I think it came out pretty well, and it was hard to get it cut and get the tape lifted up in particular for this area. I think it was probably good enough, but if I had more time, I may have tried to redo it. I used the same claret wine red for the drop and the stylized F. And this is where I encountered an issue with the tape pulling up paint. It kept pulling up the paint I put down, even when I gave it several days in between. But it had been a little chilly around lately, so I thought maybe that was part of it. And so I kept having to tape and repair. I just wasn't really getting anywhere. And then I got some advice from a friend to actually use a space heater to help dry it out faster so it would harden properly and quickly. I put it with a small space heater in the smallest room I have, and it really helped out tremendously. And if I had not done that, I don't know if I would have had it done in time, or at least it would have been in a lot worse shape when I finished it. The Han Solo and Carbonite and Beskar P mags I bought from a page called Meme Mags on Facebook. The Solo and Carbonite one was actually a custom one I asked him to do, and the Beskar one he just offers. He's got some cool stuff, some nerd stuff, meme stuff obviously, and some not safe for work stuff on there too. But go check him out if you're interested. I got these from him pretty quick, and I am quite pleased with them. I didn't tell him I was doing a video or ask for a discount or anything. I just think he did good work. I think he has some interesting stuff, so support him if you think you might be interested. At the end of everything, I did a few clear coats to try and protect all the work I've done. And though I tried to get as nice as possible to be completed, I am aware that as I use it, the paint will get marred or scratched off. So don't invest too much time into it, as you want to be able to use this rifle and not just display it. You may have noticed some of that already, because I'm filming this after taking it shooting already, and it's just going to get worse. And I do know I could have made it a little bit easier on myself and done some of the detail work with model paint or something else like that. But I wanted to do it all with spray paint, as I thought would be more interesting and may reflect skill levels better of just the everyday person. I've never really actually done model painting, so I don't really know the ins and outs of that. And I didn't really want to mess with any other paints. It cost me between $35 and $40 for the paint. I bought the X-Acto knife at Hobby Lobby for like $5. The frog tape is a brand name, which is more expensive than most painter's tape, but was still just maybe another $6. Obviously, it's an homage to Boba Fett based on his armor rather than based on his actual rifle, since it's rather plain. But there are infinite variations. Please feel free to follow this exactly, or just take bits and pieces that you liked for inspiration for your own build. This was my first time trying something like this, and it turned out pretty well, at least in my eyes. So don't be afraid to do your own project and come up with your own design for a Boba Fett rifle build.
Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this new rifle. If you have questions about the build that weren't answered in the video, other comments or suggestions, fill them out below. And please, speak freely.